Hello everyone, welcome to the Grow Your Future podcast. I am your host, Zah and I'm joined by the gangster accountant, Sam Eljaban. How are you?
I'm fantastic.
You are very gangster, looking all black.
It's today, yes, all black. But it's funny when I deal with clients a lot of the time, they don't think I should be an accountant. They're like, you should be in some other industry. I'm like, which one?
Should be a bikie.
And I used to, when I was working in another suburb, they used to call me the pinball pirate because I'd walk around with this massive beard. People going, what the fuck's this guy?
Well, now your wife Zara, didn't she think you were?
Oh yeah,
up to no good when you guys first met?
Yes, and all those stories came out at our wedding. So my wife thought I was a bikie, and I was like, that's far from the truth. I fucking just go to an office job. So, but it's
funny how they stereotype on the way your appearance, right?
Yeah.
Like I've got a funny story. I was having dinner with a developer friend of mine who we work very, very closely with, and he said someone from a competing property investment firm called him. Mm-hmm. This was some time ago, and said, "Oh, do you work with Zah Azmi?" Mm. And the developer goes, "Oh yeah, I do actually." And they said, "Oh, don't work with him. He's the biggest gangster in Sydney." It's funny where I don't know where people get this shit from, but they I don't know, they must.
The look, the stories, people just that stuff.
The associations in the past.
2 and 2 makes 18, mate. That's how they do it. But no, that's all right. It makes us stand out.
Yeah,
which is good in business.
But it's just little old us.
That's it.
No gangsters here. We're just
office workers.
Yeah, man. Just trying to take over the world.
Glorified office workers.
So tell me, what are we talking about today?
What we're going to go through is we're going to try and see why we love Melbourne so much.
Yes.
I joked before, and coming from a money place is because Melbourne can make us a lot of money.
Yeah.
And
it's true.
Yeah.
It's true. Like I only just got back from Melbourne, so I got back yesterday. I spent the last couple of days there, and it's probably my most favourite city in Australia. Mm-hmm. If I could, I would live there.
Why is it your favourite city?
There's just so much life, and it's
sort of made more for the people.
It's multicultural. There's it's just the vibe in the city. Like we were driving through on Tuesday night on the way to dinner, and the Tuesday night nightlife in Melbourne is busier than the Saturday night nightlife in Sydney.
Oh wow!
It was buzzing.
Really?
It was pumping, man. And it was just so good to see because they got fucked in COVID, right? Like those lockdowns were the heaviest in the world, I think. And mate, they have made a very strong recovery. Like restaurants are packed, cafes are full, there are people on the streets, like, I guess they've got their fair share of crime and all of that sort of thing, but it's relatively safe. And it's just, everyone's just real social.
Do you reckon that's because they were so extreme in the locking
down? I think so.
That they came back.
I think so. There's this massive rebound where we can actually go out and do stuff, right? And they're really going for it. And it's the city has just become so alive. Like it's great at the moment because it's not super cold yet, but it will get there, like probably in about a month's time. And that's probably the one thing that lets the city down for me is just the weather.
The weather,
sometimes it's just so unbearable. That's how cold it is. And it's just raining. And that's a common thing that people in Melbourne complain about. But other than that, other than the weather, it's a fucking great city, man.
I haven't been there in probably 6 or 7 years. But you go there quite regular. What have you seen changing down there? Have you noticed big changes?
What I really, really like about the city is that it's so multicultural. So you have people from all over the world there. You've got every type of food that you can think of. If you're a foodie, Melbourne's the city to be in. And
well, they have the best restaurants.
Yeah, my wife and I, we're massive foodies. Like we love nice restaurants. We love good food. We love great coffee. They do the best coffee in Australia. If not the world. So there's so much to love about Melbourne, but from a property point of view, that's what we want to talk about today, is where the opportunity is. So we'll get started on our first point. I guess we'll compare Melbourne to Sydney.
Yep.
And it's very similar to, I guess, comparing New York to LA. And I'll always say Sydney is very much like LA, and then Melbourne's very much like New York.
Okay.
I guess if you compare it to Sydney, so Melbourne versus Sydney, we all know Sydney property prices are very, very expensive, right? You know, yields aren't really there for us property investors. If you were to buy a home, you have to spend probably about $2 million to get something semi-decent. So the value proposition's not really there anymore in Sydney from an investment point of view, right?
Even really to an extent of a homeowner point of view.
Well, how much more can we really go comparatively to wages? So, you know, the higher the prices go in Sydney, eventually it becomes just more volatile. So yes, it may grow more, and it will grow more, right? We know that, but it will also fall harder as well. So in those times of recessions, like sort of like now, you know, we've seen the biggest declines in Sydney, and that's because of its price is so overinflated, and we just steer away from it now from an investment point of view, because the value's just not there anymore. But you know, if you compare to Melbourne to Sydney in terms of property markets, Melbourne tracks about 6 to 7 years behind Sydney. So Melbourne at the moment, like you can get let's say a 1-bedroom apartment for $500,000. We're just using this as an example, right? And this is a brand new apartment in a blue chip 10 out of 10 location, and then in Sydney, let's say down the road here in Bondi Junction, there was a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom, no car spot apartment going for $1 million.
Double.
Right? And the demographics are the same, right? If you look at the weekly family incomes of the area, the affluence score, distance to the CBD, all of that sort of stuff, it's sort of the same. It's the same people in Melbourne, in that suburb, with essentially paying half for the same property. So there's a lot of value in Melbourne at the moment, and if it runs 6 to 7 years behind Sydney, and you knew where it's going to end up in another 6 to 7 years, because it's historically tracked Sydney, wouldn't you put your money there? Because 6-7 years ago, if we knew this is what was going to happen to Sydney, we probably would have bought more property in Sydney, right? So if we know history tells us that's how we're tracking, then it makes sense to put your money there.
Is there a reason that it's still an affordable place, Melbourne, say compared to Sydney?
Yeah, so I guess it's always been a little bit more affordable because it's been Sydney's been the #1 city to go to. But
so most people would come to Sydney, that drives up the prices, all that kind of stuff. And the offload would go down to Melbourne, say, or something.
That too, but also migrants are now catching on. That there's more affordable options in Melbourne. Also, back in the day, Sydney used to be quite a lot more populated than Melbourne, and it's only been recently where it's starting to catch up. They're sitting neck to neck now. So in 10 years' time, it's forecasted that Melbourne will be more populated than Sydney, and then in 30 years' time or 25 years' time, it's forecasted to get to about 8 million, which is basically what New York is. I think it's what London is as well, and those two cities, you know, that are compared to Melbourne. It's very likely that Melbourne could become that way. And if we look at property prices in New York and in London, man, property investors just aren't in there anymore because it's just more so old money passing it down to generation to generation.
It's like Sydney, it's just overcooked.
Well, that's where Sydney's at now, right? Property's being handed down to generations. You don't get it's a very small minority of people who are first home buyers who buy in Sydney from scratch. A lot of people who buy in Sydney now are people who have parents who have made a lot of equity in their homes in Sydney, and they're passing that equity down to the next generation to help them fund a purchase. I think I read something in the AFR the other day where a dad bought his kids a terrace in Paddington because they couldn't find a rental for him.
The dad just bought
one.
So
dad just bought one for 3.8 million.
Wow.
Right?
Like bang, yeah. So a lot of assistance is needed.
Yeah, exactly. And lucky for those kids that they're very blessed to have parents that are able to do that. I know my parents wouldn't be able to do that. And a lot of other people, the majority of the population, don't have that luxury. So forget about Sydney for now. Let's look at more affordable markets like Melbourne. But I truly believe Melbourne is very undervalued.
It sounds like the writing's on the wall.
Yeah.
It sounds like it hasn't had a chance to realise, because you said the populations are quite similar, yet the same type of property is so much more expensive here. It's like it hasn't caught on down there.
I think
hasn't taken time to actually realise to
catch up. So and it will, Sam. It will. So I think another reason why it's been a little bit more subdued in terms of growth is because Melbourne's set out in a way where you can have a little bit more supply. So for our listeners, just know that Melbourne is really flat. And because it's really flat, there's quite a bit of developable land compared to Sydney. Because Sydney is there's a lot of hills, and it's a beautiful city. But it's hard to develop on because it's not as flat as Melbourne. So I think there's been probably a bit more supply allowed in Melbourne as a city, which has allowed to absorb that demand and obviously not shoot prices through the roof. But slowly now, because of the infrastructure and the city being forecasted to allow such a big population pool, it's now starting to pick up, right?
Yeah. It's attracting a lot more people.
It is. And immigrants, from overseas, when they're looking at, okay, where am I going to go? Obviously, it's between two cities, Sydney and Melbourne. What's more affordable, right? Like Melbourne's more affordable. Like rents are cheaper. Property prices are, probably 30%, 40% less. It's more digestible to go to Melbourne, and Melbourne has the same, if not potentially more, opportunity than Sydney does. So, migrants, I think their first choice, especially if they're, considering their budgets and stuff like that, there's probably it's probably easier to think that they can settle in Melbourne first.
Well, in the current environment, what is the most concerning thing is money, how far it goes, inflation, all that stuff. So that affordability thing is going to become the desirable thing. You may not want to be in the best suburb. You just want to go where I can actually have a nice life.
Yes,
and that's going to be down there. So that's going to cross over.
In Sydney, like a lot of people aren't living a good life here. You know what I mean? Like you really need to be earning really good money to sort of enjoy yourself in this city. And we hear it all the time. Sydney doesn't offer that much of a lifestyle. Really, what happens in Sydney is that we just work.
You make your money here.
You make your money here.
You sort of have to do something with it.
And
escape.
And this is the reason why I travel with my family so much, because I don't actually feel like I've got much of a lifestyle here in Sydney. Like my work's here, my business is here, and I love it, right? But if I want lifestyle, I have to leave this city. Like the nightlife's no good. Crime's quite high, or it's getting higher.
To go anywhere takes an hour.
Mate, restaurants shut at 9 o'clock. You know what I mean? Like there's nothing really you can enjoy.
Enjoyable.
It's not enjoyable, right? No. So, and it's got nothing to do with the people. It's just the way the city is. Like these restaurants and clubs and everything, they actually can't afford to stay open. That's why they're shut, because they can't afford the labour costs and all of that sort of thing. And it's very tough here in Sydney, and the people who really do live good lifestyles I feel like they're ultra wealthy. So, and this is the reason why we travel so much. So, in Melbourne, I feel like there is a little bit more of a lifestyle because there's more disposable income. You see this in Brisbane as well. Like, I'm really surprised. The last time I went to Brisbane 2-3 weeks ago, and we'll do a separate podcast in Brisbane probably the next time around. But man, like there's new restaurants opening, there's new cafes, there's life. I mean, it's not buzzing like Melbourne is, but you can tell there's progression and there's growth and there's excitement and there's infrastructure going in. to support this new growth. It's a lot of interstate migration. And because even more so in Brisbane, property is cheaper, people have more money to spend on lifestyle. So here in Sydney,
everyone's cash strapped. They can't go
everyone's
out.
paying their wage to rent.
And you sort of see that in the city. Like you were saying, there's a lot of new stuff happening in those other cities. In Sydney, you don't see too much changes.
No.
I don't see. Like, they got new big infrastructure plays, but nothing like new nightlife, new areas going up and things like that.
And this is not us bashing Sydney. Like, we love Sydney, but it's just the fact that it's probably overcooked.
It's the nature of the city.
And it's over matured. And look, it'll always be a strong city, but you know, in terms of progression and growth, there's more opportunity in other cities like Melbourne. So you know, we think that property is quite undervalued there. So we're sort of trying to get down there and develop as much as we can, partner up with other developers as much as we can, you know, get those good deals while we can, which brings us to point number 2. COVID has given us an opportunity. So a lot of people think that, Melbourne was so hard done by, and I think that as well throughout the COVID lockdowns. But the thing is, I'm actually glad it happened more so for the property market, because it put a handbrake on its growth, and it allowed us to go, all right, let's take a breather and buy more property while it's still at an affordable price point. Because if Melbourne boomed at the same time as, say, Sydney did and Brisbane did, what would have happened is we might not even be in that market.
We'd be priced out.
We would have been priced out already. Okay. And a lot of people would have not probably got in because they were so scared throughout that COVID period. Where what COVID has done is gone, all right, yes, Melbourne was hard done by. Vacancy rates went through the roof because everyone exited the city. And I remember we were doing stuff in Melbourne and people were coming back to us saying, but what about the lockdowns? You know, like, they'll never recover. You know, and we always recover, right? And I think, you know, now that there's confidence there and prices are still, I guess, at pre-pandemic levels, now's the time.
Yeah, it's actually, if you look at the 3 eastern cities, Brisbane has gone up quite hard the last 2 years. Sydney's always been high and hard to get into, but it's gone up. So Melbourne is the only one really still behind, where I think once, as you say, people catch on to it and see the value there, it's going to go insane.
Well, we've got to think about it, right? The same demographics that live in Melbourne live in Sydney. So when we talk about demographics, it's more about the money that they have. So jobs in Melbourne pay just as good as jobs in Sydney. So, you know, a family household that's earning $3,000 a week in, say, Bellevue Hill, Sydney, is the same as a household in, say, Essendon, Melbourne, earning $3,000 a week. You know what I mean? So, but prices, you can get a home in Essendon for, say, 1.6 million, like a really, really nice home, but in Bellevue Hill, it's going to cost you maybe 10 million bucks. So there's that difference, right? Where people want to live around the same people. So if there are people in Sydney, for example, that want to sort of move to an equivalent suburb in Melbourne, they'll do it quite easily and probably have cash in the bank as well if they were to sell their residence here. So because there's that opportunity of value, us property investors can get at that low price point and ride that wave over the next 6-7 years. I truly believe in the next 10 years, Melbourne won't be a market that we'll be able to get our investors into because it will be priced out.
So now
it'll be very similar to Sydney.
Now's the opportunity then.
Yeah.
You sort of have to start making moves.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, like, I'll give you an example. We're developing our own townhouses, so our own product. You know, it's going to be around $750,000 for a brand new 2-bedroom townhouse, 10-12 Ks from the Melbourne CBD. You know, to do that in an equivalent suburb here in Sydney, you know, would be 1.7 million. So you're almost getting a $1 million discount, and the yields are strong, so it's positive cash flow. You'll be taking advantage of that uplift in growth because there's so much room to move, as opposed to that $1.6 million townhouse in Sydney how much further can it go, and it's at risk of volatility, right? Plus, it's got a low yield. So that $1.6 million townhouse in Sydney was once a $750,000 asset. So this is where us investors need to predict where it's going to head, because a lot of the time, like you mentioned these suburbs, and people go, "Oh, that's not a very good suburb." Not yet. Not yet.
Well, it's just like half of Sydney wasn't a good suburb.
No.
Have good suburbs.
No.
Now they're worth millions.
Redfern was no good 20 years ago, right? And now the median house price is what, $2-3 million. So, like, you've got to remember, us developers and us investors, our job is to identify where things are going to gentrify and move, because there's no point buying the $1.5 million apartment in Bondi, and it's only going to grow to 1.6, right? It'll always be strong over the long term, but us investors, we need to pick up growth early. You want that $750,000 purchase to go to, say, $1 million very fast. And that's purely going to happen because of affordability. People flock to affordable properties when times like this happen, where interest rates go up, there's a recession. Like, people who live in properties up here, where do they go to?
They downsize.
Properties down
When
here.
there's an issue, they always downsize.
When people need properties here, what do? They go to properties here. You can't go below it, right? So that's where, our goal is to focus on the affordable price points, $500,000 to say $750,000. You're going to get those positive cash flow yields, and also you've got that room for growth.
And you also got to think long term, which is that price growth over time, which Melbourne has that potential. So you still get the instantaneous short term, but it's got the long term potential. Well,
you got to remember, Sydney and Melbourne, they're the strongest markets in Australia. Like, they're the two big brothers, right? And a lot of people go, "No, I'm going to go to Perth. I'm going to go to Darwin. I'm going to go to Hobart," and sure, you can get yields and you can chase the market that way, but nothing's really ever going to beat Melbourne and Sydney. So you got to remember, you can be 10 Ks out from the Melbourne CBD and get a townhouse for 750 grand. Like, if you said that, say 10 years ago in Sydney, maybe that would have been a good deal, right? But fast forward 10 years, you've probably made $1 million.
Yeah, exactly.
And will Melbourne do that as a macro market? 100% Melbourne will grow in that direction, right? Will that $750,000 townhouse be worth 1.6 one day? 100%, it will be. I'm not saying it's going to be in the next 2 years, but it will be. And, as a developer friend of mine said, he goes, property investing is not rocket science. All you got to do is buy something and hold it for at least 10 years.
Be patient. That's it, long term. That's it. That's what a lot of people forget.
Yeah.
It's long term. They see that COVID lockdown and all that stuff and they get scared short term, but it's the long term game.
Forever. Exactly. Buy and hold forever.
Pass it to the kids.
Number 3, culture and diversity. So we've touched on this, and this is what's attracting all of these migrants coming through. So, you can get all types of foods, all types of people. You feel very at home. Me being a foreigner as well, like, I actually feel more at home in Melbourne than I do in Sydney. And that's big for migrants, because they want to come and they want to feel like they can live here forever. They can settle down, they can have families, they can start careers, they can start businesses, and they can feel comfortable.
Safe.
Yeah. So, as we all know, Australia's greatest currency is its permanent residency. And it's really, really opening up the floodgates. You sent me an interesting article the other day.
Did I?
Yeah, on immigration. You emailed it to me. It said the numbers for the last... it's like 400,000 people or something in the last 12 months.
It's in the immigration,
Yeah, so, like, they're really ramping that up.
And you know what I think as well? Melbourne... You see how Melbourne and Sydney always compete for international events?
Yes.
Melbourne always wins. And not always wins, but they have the big ones.
Well, we just had the F1 on the weekend.
Yeah, exactly. And who does that get broadcast to? The whole world.
Yeah.
Australian Open is in Melbourne. So these two cities are competing for attention and for people to come. And I think because Melbourne's winning a lot of these big events that go worldwide,
it's got more brand awareness.
So people, that's why people will go there from overseas. So there might not be heaps of Aussies down there, but everyone coming to Australia is like, I want to be where the F1 is.
Yeah.
So Australian Open. I see it on TV. So they're winning that marketing game, I think, which is going to help them get more people in the city.
That's really interesting you say that, because you've got to remember these two cities like Sydney and Melbourne, they're brands, right? And they're international cities that they're very, very recognised. Like, it was really funny. I was listening to Andrew Tate the other day, and he was saying, he was explaining how, like, you should try and get freedom where if something's happening in your country, you can take off and go to Tokyo in Japan. If there's something happening in Tokyo and you need to leave there, you can go to Melbourne, Australia. And I thought to myself, why did he say Melbourne and he didn't say Sydney? Right? And he's not from here. I don't even know if he's ever even come here. But for him to go New York, United States, and then Melbourne, you know what I mean? He didn't say Sydney. And I think back in the day, you would have said Sydney, right? Sydney, Australia. And this is an international guy who's obviously consuming his own content, and Melbourne's doing a great job at that, right? It's really like people are going, Melbourne, and it is literally becoming the first choice.
And I think it's only going to create more demand for people wanting to live there. It's a nice place, and it's going to have good future prospects.
So with migrants, Sam, like, why would Australia, encourage, like, the Albanese government at the moment are really pushing for it, right?
Migration, why? I think, there's probably a lot of different commentary about that, but I've found this to work economically in my head and from other people I've read about. So increasing your population size does two things. One, it creates more supply of labour, which we sort of need right now. Everyone's struggling to get people.
Workers,
right? And what happens in that time when there's a low supply of labour, people won't like to admit it, but the labour force has a lot of power in negotiating wages. Businesses don't like that. And a lot of the time governments will try and help business because they're the backbone of the economy. So to help them, migration can come in, increase the supply of labour, wages don't have to increase as much. So this whole debate in the political sphere about helping to raise wages and stuff over time, if there's high immigration, don't blame the migrants, it's not their fault, they're coming for a better life. But by increasing the pool of labour, if there's a lot more accountants in the industry, an accountant won't get as much money because there's a lot more supply. It's economics. So that's going to help the shortage of labour, but
it's not going to help wages.
It's not going to help wages. But then on the flip side, if you're a holder of property, which most wealthy people are in Australia, a lot of politicians are in Australia, people that want to grow their wealth, those immigrants coming over are going to have to either rent somewhere or buy. So they're going to take up more supply of this housing stock.
Which is going to push prices up.
It's going to push prices up. So it's going to create more rental demand, which will create better returns for investors. They might push more money there. That area is going to go up in value. So it has a sort of, when you think about it, if we're heavily reliant on international migration, which we are, Australia always has been. We've done a lot of big projects in the past, the snowy hydro schemes, all that kind of stuff, where a lot of migrants came from Europe and settled here. If we're heavily reliant on population growth from outside, and that's going to take an impact on our wages and our asset prices, you just have to, understand that and act accordingly, which is buy things, buy houses.
Yeah, because they're going to go up in value, right? Because the demand's going to go through the roof.
Exactly.
And I guess that's what, point number 4, we've touched on already, population forecasted growth, right?
Yep.
So it's currently, its population is 5 million.
Yep.
Its 2050 forecast, which is about 25 years away, is forecast to be about 8 million.
8 million each in Sydney and Melbourne.
In Sydney and Melbourne, but
so they're going to sort of continue growing.
They still continue to grow on its own, but Melbourne is set to take over. Right? And I think, is it going to be by much? I don't know. Probably not by that much, right? But Sydney has led the way, I think, for as long as history has told us, right? So it would be the first time that Melbourne takes over Sydney, and that just goes to show how much they're sort of winning the race, right? That I think demand-wise, there's going to be just as good jobs, if not better, in Melbourne. Some of the best schools and best hospitals are down there, which obviously attract a lot of wealthy people to live there. So I think there's a lot of money that's going to flood into that to that city capital over the next 10, 15 years.
And we have to understand the migrants that come to Australia, if they don't have money, they're very ambitious. They're either ambitious or have money, or maybe both. So they're going to compete for your job, they're going to compete for housing, they're going to compete with everything, and that's only going to drive up demand. So don't think people come and they want social welfare or anything like that. They're trying to get a better
so these
life.
are skilled migrants,
skilled
right?
migrants, engineers, doctors, all that stuff.
They've
especially
studied,
in Melbourne.
yeah, they're qualified.
They're qualified people, so you have to understand, it's not a bad thing, but they're in competition with you for assets and things, resources in this country.
Yeah.
So,
and a lot of people are not happy about that, right? Which is, understandable, right? That people aren't happy about it, but it's just the way the world works, right? We are in competition with each other, and whether that person is from China or that person's from Australia, we are all in competition with each other, and every country's population, well, most countries' populations are going to increase, right? Like over time, there's going to be more people around because that's what we do, we reproduce, right? So it just so happens to be that we live in a country where we are very much in our infancy stage, right? Like we are quite young.
People. We need people.
We've got such big landmass and only 26 million people that live here. Like we could easily hold over 50 million people, right? So yes, roads will be more congested and all of that sort of thing. We need more infrastructure to support that. But eventually, like we could have 100 million people live here if we really wanted to, So, that is always been our golden ticket as a country to go, all right, well, we need growth. Let's turn on the migration tap, right? And just let them flood in, get them working, get them paying taxes, get them buying property, get them pushing the economy into a more positive direction. Because what good is it them, as in the migrants, pushing another economy in a different country?
Everyone's competing for migrants.
Yeah.
And Australia wins a lot because we've got a good, stable political system.
And this is where we're the lucky country, right? Because it's almost like it can never fail because we've got such strong fundamentals here and so much room for people to come, right? And we can be choosy with our migrants. Like, for example, when we were looking for a nanny, when we had Cash when he was born, we would have loved to get someone from overseas, obviously, because it would have been cheaper, but you can't, right? They've got to have a specific skill set to come here. They've got to pass a test. So it's not like they're opening the doors to just anyone and everyone. They're really being selective about it to go, hey, how can you contribute to this economy and make our country better?
Yeah. And that's the thing what people might forget. They actually contribute to the growth of the country. So that's not a bad thing. But they're going to have a demand on current infrastructure and things. So you just have to understand, they're here to help grow the country, but they also create increased demand. So just like read between the lines and act accordingly.
Well, we need the workers. We need the people.
Otherwise, the country doesn't move.
Yeah, it doesn't
like
grow.
We're screaming out for workers. We don't have enough kids in this country. So we need foreign migration. Otherwise, the country doesn't work.
Yeah, we need to bring them in.
Yeah,
mail orders. Number five, housing shortage.
So that's nationwide, really. It's become, it's pretty much
it's at a historic all-time low.
And why is that? How did that come to be?
Construction, cost of construction. So construction companies are going bust left, right, and centre. One just went bust a couple of days ago, I think. Porter Davis that was actually in Melbourne.
That was Melbourne.
Yeah. ProBuild was a really big one. They were redeveloping the IMAX theatre. Now it's the W Hotel.
Yep.
That one we didn't see coming. I think Metricon had some trouble earlier on, say last year. Everyone's hurting at the moment because cost of materials are through the roof. Labour shortage. This is why we need these migrants to come in, which is pushing price of labour up. So a lot of developers are now shelving projects. They're not doing. There's land banking sites.
Yep.
I'm even land banking sites. I've chosen not to build on one of my sites because the price of construction is so expensive, and then the finished product wasn't going to value up.
Yep.
So I'm like, okay, I'll just sit on the site. And a lot of developers are doing that at the moment because they just can't get projects to stack up. Like they need to show banks so they can get their projects funded, 10 to 15% margin at least, right?
So they can't even show that.
If let's say they show a bank a 5% margin, there's too much risk in it. Why would they fund it? So a lot of developers are just going, I'm just not going to produce it. I'm going to wait till there's sort of, better conditions for us to build. So that's contributed to a shortage. I believe one of the biggest things that's contributed to the shortages is the red tape to get approvals done. Councils are just so fucking slow in this country. And it doesn't matter how busy they are, they don't work any faster. They actually work slower. And it's because they're not a, privately run organisation working off profit margins. They're just there, they're order takers and all of that sort of thing. So they just really slow things down. So the planning and approvals process here in Australia is it's just shit, right? There's just so much regulation and red tape for you to get through. By the time you get an approval, it's just too far out. And this is why a lot of people don't go through with developments and all of that sort of thing. I'm talking about mums and dads because there's just too much shit to get through. And it all costs money.
Yeah. Sorry, keep going. You want to keep
No. The floor's yours.
I was going to say, you mentioned, you talk about this sometimes with me when we're just together on our own. How you were saying developers, they're going to wait until, not wait, but there's a sort of, by not developing and shelving projects will restrict supply, which will increase, say, rental demand and rents rising. And there'll be a point in time where it becomes viable by them restricting supply more. Is that sort of...
we need rents to, as developers, we need rents to go up. At the moment, it's very unfortunate for a lot of people who can't get a rental and they can't afford the rental that they're in. But for the economy to keep running, we need the rents to keep rising because when rents keep rising, it eventually will push the value up of these properties. So these yields are starting to catch up. They're pushing up, well, they're just about to push up values of the properties because of its rise in rents. And then what will happen then is that those end values will be profitable for developers to produce the new stock because now there's a margin in it. So right now, developers are pricing up projects and their cost of the land and their cost for the build is basically what the project's going to be valued at, which is not good because you don't want the developer to work for nothing. You actually need the developer to make, between 10 and 20% in margins. So when that value starts to creep up, the end value starts to creep up by that 10, 20%, that's when developers will start going, okay, I'm going to come. And it's not really just the developer's call, it's the bank's call. Do you know what I mean? The developer wants to produce the stock, but if the bank doesn't want to fund the project, even if the developer wants to work for free, right? And the bank says, all right, don't worry, we'll work for free, we'll fund it. It's just not going to happen, right? The bank will always say no. So, number one, the developers need to make a margin because it's like asking someone to go to work and say, you go to work, you got to pay to go to work, but you actually don't get paid. It's not going to happen. You won't turn up to work. It's the same with a developer. And a lot of people say, oh, greedy developers and all of that sort of thing. Yeah, I guess there are greedy developers out there. But the general consensus is that they can't make it work. You can't tell a developer to produce 300 apartments and not get paid for it.
Of course.
He's taken on all the risk, you know what I mean? So, those values will eventually, they'll get pushed up. They always do. History tells us it does. And then it'll become viable for them to produce more stock.
So the way that market mechanism restricting supply, so shelving those projects is going to help inflate the prices of property really over time.
And I don't think they're doing it intentionally. We're shelving the projects where we're going, okay, let's just restrict supply or anything. I don't think so. It's just the fact that I guess it's a byproduct of what's happening.
Exactly.
There is no supply coming onto the market. So, man, it's pushing pressure on rents.
And just another thing, just before we move on, housing shortage. If you've noticed, the government still is pushing hard first-home buyer stuff. They increased buying thresholds and stuff. They still have the 2% shared equity thing. You can go in and buy a house with 2%, with the government-backed 18%. So the government itself aren't assisting in this shortage. They're actually exacerbating it. They're making it worse. So they're not If you think the government's going to come and save you and help you and achieve your dream or whatever, buying a house, they're helping you, but it's also creating demand, which is increasing prices. So it's not just the investors that are adding to this issue by gobbling up stock. And buying homes and helping people buy homes is doing the same thing.
And I think a lot of people need to understand is the government can't afford to produce housing. They just can't. They've got too much other things to worry about, right? So, and this is why they offer these lucrative tax breaks to private investors like us and developers to produce the stock. And this is, they always say, oh, we've got to get rid of negative gearing. We've got to hit wealthy landlords because they make too much money. But the thing is, like, it's those wealthy landlords that go out and produce the stock. It's those wealthy developers that produce the stock. They take the risk and they produce it, and they should be rewarded, not just with profit margins, but with tax breaks as well. I'm not just saying that because I do it, but they're the ones producing the stock. Like, if you just left it up to the government, do you think they're going to come up with the 10 million homes that we need, right? They're not, right? No. But if you offer a reward to these developers and these investors, maybe we might hit that. So this is where the housing shortage, it's been fueled really by the government sometimes restricting us private investors and developers from going ahead and producing. Like, I'll give you an example. That site that I'm land banking at the moment can produce 3 times 4 bedroom townhouses, right? So that's 12 bedrooms compared to what it's now. It's a 2-bedroom home, right? So I could have produced 10 more bedrooms for 10 more people, or maybe even 10 more couples, right? But I had to shelve it because it's not profitable. So I could have contributed to supply, and that's on a very small scale, right? But I could have contributed 10 more beds, right? And I'm restricted because numbers don't stack up. So think about it, when there's a tower of 500 apartments that have all 2-3 bedroom apartments in there, that's thousands of beds, right? And a developer is not doing it because he can't make it stack up. So we can't bash the wealthy people because they're the ones actually trying to help the situation.
And they don't end up just with the profit margin as well. They employ a lot of other people. So it creates economic activity. People just focus on the profit. But think of the cost. The cost is buying stuff off people, employing people. 85%, if you're saying a 15% margin, 85% they don't see. That went into the economy to help other people.
Where I live, Sam, so I live you've come to my place, I'm on a top level and I overlook the city, right? Across the road, there's 2 apartment blocks getting built, one by D Corp, one by Meriton. And it's about the same sort of height as my apartment. But every morning I go out and I drink my coffee and I look at these projects getting built. And obviously, because it's sort of like my game, I really appreciate it. And I take a minute to sort of just analyze where they're at, there's extra scaffolding up today. And and you look at the workers, because everyone's in fluoros, right? So you really see the workers, and I'm so high up, they look like little ants. But there's hundreds of these workers, and they'd be plumbers, electricians, everything, right? And I think to myself, these 2 beasts of a development companies, Meriton and D Corp, are providing so much opportunity and workflow for these people's families, right? And it's amazing. It's inspiring. It's motivating. It makes me want to do bigger things because you really are contributing to the economy. So next time, for our audiences, I know none of you really bash developers and wealthy landlords because hopefully you are one yourself. But, next time someone says that they're hard done by because of these greedy developers, think about how much they're contributing to the economy.
They're helping a lot of people,
Number 6.
Apartments and townhouses undervalued.
Yes, so houses at the moment are probably too expensive in Melbourne. But apartments and townhouses, I think, are quite undervalued. And the reason why I think they're undervalued is they haven't caught up to the house prices yet. So whereas in Sydney, apartments are even expensive, and townhomes are really expensive. So in Melbourne, I feel that you can still get a really, really good 2-bedroom apartment for $650,000 to $700,000. Like a really good one in a great location, great amenity, brand new. Townhouses you can still get from $750,000 to $1 million. Still offer really good cash flow. I think that's where the opportunity is going to be in apartments and townhouses in Melbourne. A lot of people don't like apartments and townhouses because they want the house, they want the land and all of that sort of thing, and that's where we're doing it in Brisbane at the moment. But you've got to remember, if you could have bought an apartment or a townhouse in Sydney 10 years ago, would you have done it, knowing where the Sydney market is today? You would have done it. And that's where Melbourne is at the moment. And in the next 10 years, maybe even the next 5 years, it may be unaffordable for us property investors. So now it's at that affordable price point. You can spend between $500,000 to $750,000, get something really, really decent, and you can hold it, right? Together with the tax breaks and the yields, it'll help you. It'll help you hold that asset over the long term. Sometimes people come in, and because they can't get the house and land, they will refuse to do the apartment and townhouse, meaning that they don't do anything. They would actually rather do nothing. And it's like, I use the example of Sydney. 10 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to get a house and land in Sydney. It would have been too expensive, right? But now, right, like if you had bought an apartment 10 years ago, mate, you'd be laughing, and this is where I think the Australian market is slow to accept that apartments are great investments. Yes, I would say 90% of apartments out there are shit, but if you can really understand the apartment space, you can really do well. And we have to remember that, the Australian market want house and land, but these migrants, what are they used to living in? Apartments. You've got in Tokyo people bringing up families in 52 square meter apartment floor plans, right? Like they're used to living in confined spaces. So apartment living, I think, over the next 10, 20 years is really going to boom in Australia because it's just going to be more accepted. Yeah, the local Australian family would not prefer it. They fuck off to Brisbane, fair enough, right? But these migrants that come in, they're going to gobble up all of this good apartment stock. They'll even gobble up the shit apartment stock because they're used to living in sometimes slums back in their home countries, right? So, we've got to remember that our shit apartment stock in Australia is still more blue chip than compared to the rest of the world, right? In most other countries. So, we've got to remember that. I'm not saying buy that bad stock, but like understand that Australian real estate is actually really good, regardless whether it's an apartment or a house.
And the new Aussies are gonna be happy to live there.
Yeah,
happy to live.
Yeah, let's keep moving. Best schools in the country. So when I say schools, I mean like universities. I mean primary schools, high schools, all of that sort of thing. And it's actually well known that the schools are very, very good down in Melbourne. A lot of people, I'm finding, because obviously I'm from Malaysia, I go back once a year. I talk to people who have students that they're sending here to study. And just like the Australian Open and the F1, they're choosing Melbourne over Sydney.
I see.
Number one, it's more affordable. But number two, the unis actually are very fucking good in Melbourne for them to go. Because at the end of the day, when you think about it, these overseas students, why are they sending them to these unis here? They can learn the same shit in their own country. They're sending it for status. So if they say...
on the resume and stuff like that.
Exactly. So if they say, oh, I've got a Bachelor of whatever from the University of Melbourne or Monash University or whatever it is, right? It's considered high ranking, right? So if you're hearing, or I'm hearing, a lot more students coming here specifically for Melbourne, it's because of that status. They want that brand, right? And also, if you had to choose between Melbourne and Sydney, why wouldn't you choose Melbourne? It's cheaper. Right? Like
better schooling and cheaper.
Housing's cheaper. Like don't forget, like these students, they need to pay rent, right? And whether they're funding it themselves or their parents, it makes more sense. Like if it was me and I was funding my son, I'll go, go to the one that costs $500 a week instead of $1,000 a week because you're gonna get equal amount of status.
I didn't really know this was a thing until I had ex-colleagues having kids. Right? I've always been around investors and this guy was trying to buy his house, and where did he end up? In the hills area, but it was close to a school, a really good school. And he was fighting to be in this vicinity catchment, so he could take his kid to that school.
Yeah, it's a big thing, man. It's a big thing.
So I can imagine it's the same down there.
And it's something. Yes, it is. It is, and because I've got a lot of wealthy friends that live down there, and they fight to be in these suburbs. And it's something I've got to think about too. Like here, living in Sydney, going, oh yeah, okay. Well, can't send my kid to Chinatown because I live in the city, so I have to think of where do I want Cassius to go to school in probably 4 or 5 years time. And what happens with these markets with the really good school catchments is they just go through the roof. Like a really good example is Strathfield, where there's a lot of good schools within that Strathfield school catchment area, compared to the neighbouring suburbs where it doesn't have that catchment. And they're the same suburb. Like it benefits from the same infrastructure. It's the same demographic that lives there, but one's worth, median house price of $4 million and the other one's like 2.5.
It's crazy.
Right? It's crazy because these wealthy families fight to get into these catchments because they want to be around the same people themselves, because they know that the people with money have kids in those schools and they want to be surrounded by that as well, and they want their kids to be surrounded by that. It's really just a whole networking game. And whether that's right or wrong, whether we agree with it or not, whether we like public schools or private schools, that's the market.
It's happening.
It's happening.
You just have to deal with it.
Exactly. And from a macro level, I think schools and university, they really are held in high regard in Melbourne. And there's obviously bad areas, but there's a lot of good areas down there. Number 8, construction. The construction time is probably the best per capital city. So when I say best per capital city, this is my experience from Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, because these are the only markets that we specialise in. We don't go outside of that. I'm finding that construction times in Melbourne are faster and more on track and more reliable than, say, Southeast Queensland. Southeast Queensland's just whatever I can do in Melbourne, in Southeast Queensland, it takes me twice as long.
Do you think that's because of the boom and they weren't prepared? There's just too much activity.
They can't handle it. I just feel like they can't handle it.
There's too much.
You can't get trades. Like if you're a tradie listening to this, go move to Brisbane because you'll make a lot of money.
Make a fortune.
Yeah, there you can command a lot, and there's just not enough of them there. And there's just so much building going on. And I think with Melbourne, there's a higher population. Obviously, more migrants now are coming through, which is providing more workers. And also, they didn't get hit with that building boom as much as Southeast Queensland. They still did because the whole country went through it, but it's not as I guess as bad as Southeast Queensland. And we're fortunate because we're in several different markets around the country, so we can make the comparisons. We can judge how long does a house and land take, how long does an apartment take. We've got our own developments that we're doing where we can sort of track that. How many builders are going bust in each state, all of that sort of thing. So right now, construction is tracking along really, really nicely in Melbourne.
And that's important for us investors because the quicker the project's done, the quicker you get it rented, the quicker the equity is gained, you can do it again.
You can move. You can keep moving.
So if it's too delayed, it's just going to slow you down. So you really want to sort of invest where it's efficient.
It's a good time. Number 9, best biomedical precinct in the world. So, like I said earlier, they've got some of the best hospitals down there. The medical precinct is massive, which means they've got a lot of fly-in, fly-out type of people that sort of work in that industry. There's a lot of research and science, and it's some of the best in the world, right? And when it's some of the best in the world, you get these skilled migrants who are doctors and specialists, and these are very highly qualified people who have the potential to earn a lot of money and contribute so much to our economy. If the biggest, or if it's the best medical precinct in the world, they're not going to go to Sydney. They're going to go to Melbourne, right? So these high net worth sort of valued people are going to then reside there, which is going to push up prices of really, really good stock, which is great for the economy.
So it's like the schools and the events, the hospital itself. It's funny, the hospital would attract people and it makes sense, but you wouldn't think about that like in normal.
It's funny, right? I'll give you an example. We did a project in Ivanhoe, and Ivanhoe's like 8-9 k's from the CBD, and great suburb, 10 out of 10, really really nice suburb. But it's situated very close to one of the biggest medical precincts in Melbourne. And we've been exploring Airbnbs in Ivanhoe. So I've been talking to my management firm that specialise in it, and they said Ivanhoe Airbnbs are at 100% occupancy rates.
What? There's none.
And I said, why is that? Because it's not a touristy area, Sam. I'm like, because I think
it's right next to a massive hospital.
Yeah, everyone thinks Airbnbs are for tourists, right? And that's originally what I thought. But he said, no, because you get so many fly-in, fly-out doctors and nurses and specialists that come in. They need somewhere to stay, and there's not enough stock, short-term rental stock. So it's at 100. So if you've got anything in Ivanhoe, you can be guaranteed that you'll probably earn more than a standard long-term lease. So that's something we're exploring. So that's a really good example of what the medical industry can do for the property market. Number 10, it supports our fundamentals. So whether it's location, we got relationships with the best builders and developers down there. We've talked about supply and demand. And we talked about the right stage of the cycle. So, we know that the yields are there. It just ticks all the boxes. So for us, to be involved in one of the strongest capital city markets in the world at a time where stuff is so undervalued, it really makes it an exciting time. And I think a lot of people are going, oh, we've seen the boom, it's never going to happen again, and all of that sort of thing. Mark my words, like Melbourne's going to be the market.
It's been waiting.
And I think, I think we're really blessed that we're at this point in time where we're at pre-pandemic sort of levels of buying. Like for example, I just bought a site which I bought it for the same price at the person previously bought it in 2018.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, so it's just
5 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we haven't had that much growth, which is a good thing because now's the time before it starts to take off.
Amazing.
Thank you, Sam.
No worries, man.
That went for quite a long time. I think next time we'll do Brisbane. We'll probably squeeze in a trip between now and then. Just to get really familiar or re-familiar. Thank you, Sam. I appreciate your time. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I can't wait to see you next time. Peace out.